My name is Fareed Khan. I'm the founder of the anti-racism activist group Canadians United Against Hate. As well, I'm the Director of Advocacy and Media Relations for the Rohingya Human Rights Network. I would like to welcome viewers to what will hopefully be the first in a series of diversity dialogues with prominent people who work in the area of human rights and anti-racism. We are privileged to have as our first guest on Diversity Dialogues, Isha Khan, CEO, recently appointed, of the Canadian Museum for Human Rights. Isha is a lawyer who has spent her career upholding human rights, both in private practice and formerly with the Manitoba Human Rights Commission. She began at the Commission as special counsel, eventually ended up moving into the role of executive director, a role which she held for 4 years. Prior to joining the Commission, Isha worked in a management role with the United Way of Winnipeg and is currently the chair of its board. Prior to that, she was an associate with the law firm of Borden Ladner Gervais in Calgary. Isha got her bachelor's degree in philosophy and religious studies at the University of Manitoba and then attended the University of Victoria, where she obtained her law degree. She was appointed to the post of CEO at the Human Rights Museum by the Canadian Minister of Heritage on August 17th. She is the first woman as well as the first person of color to be appointed as CEO of the museum on a permanent basis. Isha, I'd like to welcome you to Diversity Dialogue and thank you very much for being our very first guest.
Thank you for allowing me to be your first guest. I'm happy to be here.
Yeah. I would, for the sake of full disclosure, Isha and I share a last name, but to our knowledge, we have no relation, so nepotism was not involved in any way in getting this interview.
That's right.
Okay. Now, having someone who's a person of color and a Muslim as the CEO of the Human Rights Museum was something that was noticed across the country when your appointment was announced. And I imagine it was because we have so few people of color at the top executive level in major Canadian institutions and businesses. Your appointment was certainly noticed within Canada's Muslim community, and the news of your appointment was shared widely on social media. I would like to begin by asking, how is it that you decided to pursue a legal career defending human rights? Was it something that you had thought about when you were young? Was it something you decided upon later in life? Or was there some personal experience that pushed you in this direction?
I think it was a bit of all of those things. So when I was young, to be perfectly honest, when I was really young, I knew that I liked to talk. I like to meet people and be out there chatting with different people. And as I grew up, I began to sort of channel that energy of wanting to connect with people a little bit more. And it grew into a desire to be an advocate, and like many folks in the social justice community, I think I wanted to change the world. And so, I pursued philosophy and thinking about things like any young person does, and it led me to advocacy and to law. Later in my career, I knew I wanted to really pursue the human side of law. I liked being in court. I liked standing up and arguing, and I respected the two sides to every story, which led me really to my work as a litigator and then eventually into the human rights world. But I always had that inner desire to, I guess, to use my ability or what I had been able to hone in terms of the ability to speak publicly, to speak for others.
Certainly, as the CEO of the Human Rights Museum, as a woman, as a woman of color, as a Muslim, you are likely seen as a role model by many young women and certainly probably many Muslim girls. What would you say to those who admire you and see you as a role model? What would you say to them on what they need to do if they are interested in pursuing issues related to social justice and human rights and fighting for those who are persecuted and oppressed? What would you say to them on how to pursue a career in that direction?
So I'm going to avoid the usual self-deprecating humor that I often rely on when people talk about, my appointment and being seen. And in all sincerity, what I would say to people who are looking at this position, or me in this position, keenly and reflecting on that, it seems quite simple, but you can do anything you want. The world will change with you. It just might take a bit of time, and it takes some perseverance, I think. I've been really, really lucky, and I always make it clear I come from a position of privilege in that I've been surrounded by a lot of support. My friends, my family, they lift me up, and always have. So it probably was easier for me than it will be for everyone, to pursue what they want to do. And if they want to enter the world of human rights, you learn a lot about yourself and your motivations. I say that because the reasons that I went into this work probably have changed over the years, or the way that I approach the work is a little bit more measured than it would have been if you had talked to me when I was 21 and I was probably more of a, I was at a demonstration and I was yelling about something. And now I realize that sometimes another way, not the only way, but another way of making change is to make connections and to slowly bring people along to your way of thinking. And so advocacy is a good way of doing that, but you have to pace yourself a little bit. Like, you'll get there. It may not come to you as quickly as you want it to.
Hmm. You're coming into your role in a very tumultuous year. 2020 will be a year that'll be remembered for many reasons beyond the COVID-19 pandemic. One of those is the heightened attention given to issues of civil liberties and human rights, and racism arising out of the killing of George Floyd by a U.S. police officer. The death of this helpless Black man shocked the world when it was shared on video, and resulted in large anti-racism and Black Lives Matter protests across North America and overseas this past summer. Your appointment came after the museum found itself in controversy due to a social media post about such a protest. The reaction to the posts were allegations of hypocrisy and racism, homophobia, sexism, and censorship at the museum by current and former employees. Following the allegation, an independent investigation found that racism was pervasive and systemic at the museum, and the phrase toxic workplace was used to refer to the museum's work environment. Coming as you are into this role at this seminal moment in history, when there are calls to address racism in society and protect the human rights of racialized minorities, how are you going to be addressing the controversial allegations that have been made and restore the damaged integrity and confidence in the work of the museum?
I think that I'm at the museum, or I've arrived at the museum at a very unique point in history. So the whole world is engaged in a discussion around human rights, and it takes various forms. It's editorials, it's opinions, it's activism, and advocacy. And my approach to how are we going to deal with the problems within, to be honest, is the same approach that I think that I would have brought in had there not been these issues surfacing over the last several months. And I say that because we know that this exists in organizations all over the country, all over the world, that there's racism, there's anti-Black sentiment, there's Islamophobia, homophobia, all of those issues are present. I don't think that I can be the solution. I'm planning to do this with the community around me and with our staff within. So what I'm learning, and this is something about myself, I want to just go. I want to do it. Let's fix it. Let's make this better. That's my natural inclination. But it's going to be, we have to pace ourselves. There's some things that will be easy to do because they're just the basic human thing to do, to fix a problem, get rid of a policy, change the way we interact with each other. But I think if we're going to do things differently and do it right, it won't just be an action plan or hiring a person of color. for it to be meaningful, I think we actually have to think about why we're doing it. Why are we in this situation? Why do we shy away from issues of diversity or say, well, we don't really understand how to deal with it? Why do we make people of color or people from marginalized groups shoulder the burden of giving the answers to this is what you ought to do? I'm really mindful of that because I've thought about that for years. I've been on a million committees and giving my thoughts, and I think, why don't we already know the answers? I think we do. I think we have to actually change the way we're behaving with one another. So that's, I mean, I could speak at length about it, but I think that's how we're going to tackle our issues here, is we're going to do it together, and we're going to think about why this is an issue in the first place in our work environment. We'll seek guidance, absolutely, from the community. If we're going to move forward, we have to have people who support us. And I really see those who critiqued our situation, and rightly so, in many respects, they did so because they care. They care about how we ought to act with one another and how we ought to behave as an institution with our public. And so I'm going to really lean on the folks around us to help bring them into our conversation so that we can do it, so we can move forward together.
You mentioned that there are ways that the roles that we can play in trying to change attitudes. As someone myself who has been involved in advocacy for more than 35 years and has watched the evolution of issues related to human rights and racism, it seems like we're having the same conversations over and over and over again. Something happens, there's shock, there's outrage, politicians react, there's thoughts and prayers and condolences and promises to do better. And yet it doesn't seem like things are getting better. In fact, over the last decade or so, one could reasonably argue that issues, for example, related to racism connected to human rights have gotten worse. So how do you think that, what are some of your thoughts on how we can do better? Because as someone who has been watching this for almost 50 years, I became very politically aware at a very young age. You get to a point where you say, what, I'm just tired. I'm just tired of waiting. I don't want to wait anymore. I want it now. How do you respond to that?
I get it. I get it. There's this, we talk about the attention to human rights. It's been there forever. It's just who had the attention, in whose mind was this an issue, and was it out there? So these issues have been around forever. And they won't go away immediately. I understand that. Human beings naturally are, look to align themselves with one another and seek out their differences. It's how we think about those differences. To be honest, being in the position that I am now at the museum, a place that is founded on this idea that we bring together people to dialogue, to talk about what human rights means, I think is one of the ways of doing things differently. It's to not shy away from different opinions, but to bring them together. It's a bit of what litigation looks like in a different format. Human rights advocacy looks like that, but bring the two sides together and talk about where you can find some commonality. And to your point about people who are tired, yeah, I get it. It's tiring thinking that nothing changes, but I think publicly it sometimes looks like that, and then we look for those little nuggets of kind of the quiet work that's happening, and you see it. I witnessed a conversation between one of my kids and her grandfather, and she spews out this beautiful articulate sentence, or a few sentences about the role of Indigenous people in history and what it means to us today. And I think, okay, these are the nuggets I have to hold on to. There is change. But I say to many who ask about diversity and inclusion work, sometimes it's quiet work. sometimes it's not the initiative, the money, the public announcement. It's quiet work that's happening amongst each other, and we celebrate it when it happens, but it's I think when we look for that, it makes you feel a little bit assured that, okay, we are charting a course. It's just slower than we'd like.
Yes, I can agree with you. It's far slower than I'd like, certainly, given the amount of time that I've spent. One of the things that I've been trying to advocate for, it was in some recommendations which I was involved in crafting that went to the parliamentary committee that was looking at the M103 Islamophobia motion back in 2017. One of the things was to try and get courses in high school, mandatory courses in high school dedicated to looking at the history of human rights and racism in Canada, because it seems Canadians are woefully and inadequately informed about the roles that things like genocide and racism played in the creation of this country. And while younger people may be more aware of it, they certainly don't receive a course in it at the high school level. A lot of them don't usually learn about this stuff until they get to university. Would there be a role for the museum allying with other groups to try and get provincial governments to actually include curriculum, mandatory curriculum in schools that looks at issues of human rights, like certainly in the Canadian context, issues of human rights and racism?
I mean, I think that you hit the nail on the head when we talk about education and talking about human rights and doing it from a very early age. The museum already, that's what their public programs are for, and that's why they bring in students into their space, but also digitally to have more resources available for students and teachers and anyone who wants to learn about our history. Because we can't really understand issues of racism and oppression unless we understand our history as Canadians, but also around the world in those specific contexts. So I think absolutely the museum, it's founded on the idea that it's a community space, that we can reflect the stories of our past, but that we can then dialogue. And those are big words, what does that mean? But the idea really is that we can connect on issues about rights, the advancements of rights, the struggles, but also the achievements, so that we can collectively promote some action. So in that way, I absolutely think the museum has a role to play in terms of educating our youth and finding those ways to collaborate with governments or other work that's being done out there on the education front. Because I think we really have this unique place, at least in the Canadian context, physically situated here in the center of Canada and on ancestral grounds that are very important to many First Nations and First Peoples of Canada, but also because it is our mandate to promote human rights through that education lens. So a long way of saying, yeah, I think absolutely I hope that we will see the museum out there building on the work they've already done in sort of educational or public programming, but even I hope we're even more bold in doing that work, because I do think, to your earlier questions, that's the ticket. That is educating our young people, because they talk to their parents and their grandparents and their neighbors and working retail, their customers, and that's how we start to change ideas all around us.
Museums are a unique institution. They're meant to educate, and they're supposed to provide insight and context into the issues that they cover. But museums look at issues through a retrospective lens. But developments and issues around human rights abuses are popping up all the time. And the museum in its displays and presentations tends to be behind the curve, especially when you look at issues of human rights. Given the current heightened awareness around human rights, as well as its related focus on racism, can you see a way that the museum could be more current and do a better job of raising awareness among Canadians in real time about the critical nature of human rights in our society?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the entire museum sector is grappling with issues about how to be more relevant to the public, to Canadians. And I think, I'm fortunate in that the Canadian Museum for Human Rights is already doing some of that work because their mandate is quite unique. And so the idea of having a digital presence, the timing is right with current pandemic and restrictions on people moving around and traveling the way that we used to. The idea of being able to access information and to dialogue like we are now is huge. It's changing the way we interact with each other all the time. So there's already good work being done here, and I think we will only push that work forward because, to your point, we have to be ahead of the game. We have to be talking about emerging human rights issues. We have to be able to respond in real time to issues. And that is a lot of the work and the discussions we're having now. As I've arrived, some of it is already happening, but trying to push that forward. I think this is the time to do it.
You were at the Manitoba Human Rights Commission during a very critical time for human rights in Canada. Canada's involvement in the so-called war on terror following the 9/11 attacks resulted in national security legislation that many in the Muslim community feel unjustly targeted Canadian Muslims. One example was in the previous government under Stephen Harper, Bill 51, which received a lot of criticism. There were reports of the RCMP and CSIS having spies in mosques across the country, which was, very disturbing. The political focus on Muslims generated fear of Muslims among Canadians and resulted in acts of hate and bigotry targeting the community. As someone who practiced human rights law, could you give your take on how the defense of human rights has been valued by Canadian politicians in recent history, and what we need to do as Canadians to make sure that our rights aren't being chipped away little by little?
So I remember very vividly the morning of 9/11 and watching TV in a law firm in Calgary, and I remember very vividly the attack on the mosque in Quebec some years ago. And what sits with me is the feeling that I had as a Muslim, watching those events unfold, but also the conversations that I had immediately after with the people around me. And I say that because it was clear to me that as Canadians, we do a lot of looking around at, that's somebody else's problem, or that's happening somewhere else and we're okay. And it's in our individual interactions that you see where people's minds really are at in terms of what they think of our differences. And so while at the Human Rights Commission, those are the kinds of cases I had, the individual cases of discrimination, working with people who daily or in the course of some interaction with a public body like a government, like an educational institution or a retailer for that matter, a landlord, were othered, right? Had their rights infringed, had their dignity impacted in some way. And it taught me that I think what we need to do when we think about I think governments, public institutions need to look to marginalized groups, people who haven't had the same opportunities, listen to what they have to say, and not listen to it from a lens of we're going to respond and we're going to deal with that one issue today, but listen to their experience about how they feel in all of those daily interactions, which often it exposes the systemic nature of racism and discrimination within our structures. So what I would say in what I'm learning, because I continue to learn and I continue to adapt what my approach is, and it depends on who I'm working with. I think in the same way that we as individuals learn from the guy down the street who tells us a story that we, provokes a certain reaction or a sentiment that we disagree with, governments need to do the same things. And the only way they can do that is to be representative of the public they serve. That's how so it's not just to tokenize people of color, it's to bring them in the ranks of decision making and to actually thoughtfully listen to their perspectives and think about where they're coming from.
I think we've seen that happen over the years where governments have tried to do that, but it still seems that we are a long way from achieving, the true goal, the goal of true equality in terms of representation. I think a lot of people, and certainly we've seen it in, voiced in demonstrations over this past summer, are once again saying that, we're tired of waiting, and we want our politicians to basically take action now. As someone who's, been in advocacy for my entire professional career, there are some things that you can do quickly and some things that take longer, but this particular thing seems to have taken far longer than one would reasonably expect. And how do you respond to those people? Like, what do you tell them when they're saying, look, we've been doing this for, I've been watching this for 50 years, and others have, the Black community has said, look, we came here, our ancestors came here as slaves. Indigenous people, talk about, our lands were taken away. We were basically non-persons. And yet, even now, after all the acknowledgements, we're still not seeing the promises fulfilled. How can you keep them optimistic about what the future holds in this area?
I think that one of the keys to keeping that optimism is to recognize, what we term as the allies, right? People of color or people who've been oppressed have already know that this stuff is happening, are tired of fighting the fight. The key is those people who we work with, who surround us, who we term our allies, who now are stepping up, and who perhaps are feeling that urgency mixed with that exhaustion that people of color express, that Black people expressed this, especially in the events that occurred over the last few months. So I think, I understand. I don't think that you can tell a person not to feel frustrated, not to feel angry, but I do think that if you look around and you find, there are people, allies who we can work with, there are ways of making change. We have to have enough hope. If we don't have hope, we won't move forward. We really won't. And so it's finding, and for every person it'll be different and it'll take longer, and some people may not, the optimism isn't right before them, but maybe a few things will happen in their life that'll shift the balance a little bit, and they'll say, okay, willing to give this a shot. And I see that happen sometimes. I've seen that in the human rights cases that I've argued or been involved in. You sometimes see a little bit of a shift from anger to acceptance, not of what's wrong, but that there can be change. So that's what I would say. I'm innately an optimist, but I think you have to be if you do this work, because it's difficult work and it's you have to persevere. And I think that for those that are exhausted, know that others will persevere on your behalf, and you come back to it when you're ready to. This is not just one person's issue or one community's issue, right? It's all of ours. So I'm encouraged by places like where I am sitting right now, which mindful that there's work to do internally to refocus us on our mandate, but that mandate is quite pure, and I'm excited to be part of finding ways to bring communities and allies together, so that it doesn't necessarily feel like one group's issue anymore. We kind of share the load and the the burden, the responsibility of actually making change.
Actually, not to sound, I know my questions have a bit of a negative bent, but if I wasn't optimistic and hopeful, I still wouldn't be doing what I'm doing.
Exactly.
Just to let you know.
Yeah.
One of the most controversial issues around human rights in the country over the last year or so was the passage of Quebec's Bill 21, its so-called secularism law, which primarily impacts racialized religious minorities. Quebec Premier Francois Legault justified the law based on the fact that a majority of Quebecers were in favor of it. Many critics say he was caving to racist and prejudicial attitudes among Francophone Quebecers in passing the law. Last year, during the federal election, when the party leaders were asked what they would do about the law, all of them but one, Justin Trudeau, said they would do nothing because it was within provincial jurisdiction. Based on your legal background, I imagine that you have some, thoughts on this. Could you give your view on whether there's a chance of success of the constitutional challenges to the law that are currently working their way through the court system?
So I think that the fact that the issue is within our justice system is a good thing. It's also, I won't say a bad thing, but maybe not entirely the solution. I think our justice system is changing. It's also shifting with the needs of what Canadians want to see. And the world has shifted a little bit. So you see our justice structures, our courts, our tribunals shifting the way that they look at issues like this so that they can respond to the politics of the day, respond to legal challenges in a way that perhaps they didn't have to before. So there's some promise there. Like any lawyer, I can provide information and perspective, but I will not provide advice and opinion. I say that somewhat facetiously, but the issues in the legal community that raised, or the reaction that Bill 21 posed, people rely on our justice systems to solve the problem. And if you look at the underlying issues with the bill, are shared by community. They're not just for our justice system to deal with, because we know that laws are passed because elected officials represent the communities they serve, and that's how our system works. So my perspective is that our justice system is shifting a little bit in terms of recognizing the importance of representation, of dealing with issues from a human rights lens. So I have a lot of optimism there. But I think that community has to continue to push our justice system to deal with issues like constitutional challenges, to actually ensure that our Constitution is lived by Canadians.
Well, it's obviously an ongoing issue. I know that one of the disappointments that happened earlier this year with Bill 21 was the fact that the Supreme Court refused to hear an argument about having an injunction imposed on the bill while it was being argued. So that was a bit of a disappointment, but the challenge continues to progress, and I think people across the country are watching very carefully as to what happens with this, because it speaks fundamentally to issues of defense of human rights and charter rights in particular, and what governments, some governments, try to do to actually limit those rights. So but to another question, and I'm not sure if this is a fair question, but I'm going to pose it anyway. If you were a teacher who had to grade the Canadian government on its human rights record, not just in terms of defending the human rights of Canadians, but also in defending the human rights of persecuted minorities outside the country, like Palestinians, the Rohingya, Uyghurs, and others, what grade would you give Canada, and what advice would you give on how Canada could improve its efforts?
So I won't give a grade because I think that would be a simple answer, right? I think that governments are complex machines, but governments, if we look at how they're formed and what they're intended to do, they should voice the views of the people. And when that balance gets out of whack, we have problems. So with that, I would say our governments are complex machines, and yet they need to behave in the way that we would expect any of us as individuals to behave. So respecting the views of others, listening to what seem to be minority views and considering them. Maybe not always, it may not always be apparent, but in their decision making, considering that. So when I look at, for example, many of the stories that are told here, the story of the Rohingya, many of the stories, the story of the Holocaust, within this museum, you see, if for us to tell and give an accurate picture of history, we do expose governments for their mistakes, for their, we present facts. This is what happened, and then we react to it. So I don't think I'm in a position to give a grade per se, but I will say we need to demand of our governments that our views are expressed in policy, in international relations, in domestic affairs. That's on us. As long as we're doing that part, we can be part of that grading system, right? And I think part of the mandate of this museum is to ensure that people feel that desire or try to find that spark in them for action and for, to stand up for rights, to learn more. The more that Canadians become attuned to wanting to be part of that dialogue, I think our governments, I hope, our governments will respond.
Well, I've come to the end of my prepared questions. I'm just wondering if there's anything else you would like to say to the viewers relating to human rights or racism, and how we should view their place in our day-to-day lives or relating to the heightened attention being given to issues of racism in history at this moment.
I would challenge everyone to think about why race matters. Why do we even have to have a conversation about human rights? Because I've seen it happen that people say, oh, I don't really think a lot about that. And then I look around and say, well, who is thinking about this stuff? It's usually not the people who are thinking about it are the people who are impacted by power structures, by social structures that don't allow them the opportunity to succeed. So I would challenge anyone that when you hear someone say, oh yeah, I don't really think a lot about human rights, I've never really thought about that, to say, why not? Why don't you think about it? Because I think if we thought a little bit more about our identity as Canadians and about our rights, we would be so much further along in furthering the rights that we know that aren't always recognized.
Well, Aisha, thank you so much for taking time out of your busy schedule. Thank you for being our first guest once again. I think we covered a broad range of issues, and hopefully at some point, we'll be able to dialogue again after COVID-19. I certainly hope to meet you in person. And I think I and the people who are watching this diversity dialogue wish you well as you take on the challenges in your role as CEO of the Human Rights Museum. I'm sure that there's a lot of people across the country who are going to be watching as you get comfortable in your role.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.